All right. Welcome, you guys. Thanks so much for joining us this morning or this evening or this afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. Looks like we've got an international audience here, which is really exciting to see, and people from all over the country. So flattering that you're choosing to spend your time with us. We know you've got a lot of different ways that you can be spending your time. So really appreciate you joining us today. Would love to get started with the check-in. We'll use the chat for this. A lot of you have already shared where you're joining from, so feel free to share that again in either the district or the school that you work at, maybe even your role there. But one thing I'd love to hear from you as we kind of get acclimated and set up here in our webinar is one thing you're hoping to get out of this conversation. You know the title of the webinar, you probably have read the description. So I'm curious if there was a specific thing that drove you here or that you're really hoping to get out of it. Let me know in the chat. If you see me looking to the left, I've got your chat on another screen here. So I'm going to be checking that as we go. So think that over. Feel free to drop it in anytime. I'm going to keep kind of looking through that as we get set up here in our conversation. But part of that setup, one thing actually I will mention as you're doing that check-in in the chat, if you look at the blue box kind of above where you type in the chat, be sure that's set to everyone. I think automatically sometimes it'll set it to just panelists, which means just I will see it. So make sure it's set for everyone so we can all engage in that chat. And use the chat through the whole conversation. I wish that we were in an environment where we're all sitting in a room together and we can engage and you can give me immediate feedback, or even that we were on a Zoom call where I can see your faces, you can come off mute, but we are in a webinar format. And so I have found that using that chat feature really helps to kind of replicate that as much as possible, and love the check-ins that you guys are already leaving here. So keep that coming. As you're doing that, just going to tell you a little bit about our time here today and what we're going to cover. My name is Shelby McIntosh. If you have not met me before, I'm a managing partner at Education Elements, and I have just a little bit about my background. I've been in education my whole career, started out as a teacher, practitioner, spent some time in education policy in DC, and really have been in this space of consulting and research-based consulting and stakeholder feedback for almost 15 years now, which makes me feel really old, but I love it. It's something I feel very passionate about. I have had the benefit of using stakeholder feedback in all kinds of different areas of my consulting practice. So as you'll see, I'll tell some of those stories as we go through the content today, but something I very much believe in, and I'm excited that so many of you are interested in talking more about it today. Our specific objectives are what you see here. That first one is, pulled directly from the description of the webinar, that we really wanted to take some time to talk about how stakeholder feedback can help you in kind of three specific areas: building trust with your community, stakeholders in general, giving you some strategic direction, whether that is related to building a strategic plan or just making some specific decisions or setting direction for the year, and then finally, driving student outcomes. One thing I want to note is that these are all three very big, weighty topics in and of themselves that we could spend days talking about. And I'm going to fit content around all three of these into 1 hour or less. So obviously that means you're going to get a very 10,000-foot view here. That's really the point of this webinar, is to give you some nuggets of information, some general tips. And then if you're interested in digging deeper into any of these, I'm going to give you some ideas before we leave here today about how you can really dig in deeper, at least with us, if you want to. The other objective here is I hope to inspire at least one idea that you are excited to try, that you want to bring back to your team or your school or your district. If I can accomplish that today, it'll feel like a win for me. And then my last, I would have called it a hidden agenda here, but I'm unhiding it and I'm naming it out in front, is that I'm really interested in creating a community of practice around this topic. And our organization is Education Elements is. So I'm hoping that through this conversation, we generate some interest around this in general and get you guys excited to join something like that. So I will mention the opportunities for that at the end as well. So I'm naming that's one of my objectives here going into it, hoping that I can get there for you guys. Again, thanks for putting all this check-in in here. I'm going to keep reading it as we go. If you missed the check-in question, it was, tell us a little bit about what you're hoping to get out of the webinar today. as we go through these objectives, I'm going to do my best to address some of those as well. Just a little bit about Education Elements. If you are not familiar with us, we are a consulting group that works primarily in the K through 12 space, but all over the country. Our mission, as you see here, is, or our vision is that schools grow when people grow. So we very much invest in growing people in all areas of the K-12 space, whether it's teachers or leaders at the school level, at the district level. Our mission is to create a more equitable and just future by changing how people design for each student's potential. I name that because you're going to see that show up in how I talk about the use of stakeholder feedback quite a bit today. We're really proud of the work that we do across the country. We're in over 1,000 schools and districts. We've been doing this for over 10 years. We have really high levels of satisfaction and lots of return customers. And so I'm telling you that now because I'm going to be pretty specific and pretty strong in my opinions today about this topic, but I want you to know that it's coming from this experience that we really believe in and that we feel is making pretty great impact across the country. So I want you to know that's where we're coming from. And yeah, I'll continue to draw stories from that experience as we go through this today. The other thing I want you to know about our organization before we jump too deeply into this content here is that we, about a year and a half ago, launched what we call service line around this concept of data culture. We feel like districts and schools have a ton of data. There's been such an investment in empowering school systems with really high quality data in all kinds of different areas of K-12 education. But where we're still needing to grow and develop is how to use that information in an impactful way. So this line of service we do around data culture is really designed for that purpose. Let's think about how we create a culture of really impactful data use. And what I'm showing you here is our framework for that, how we think about a strong data culture, how we define it. I'm not going to go into the details of this framework here. I will tell you, if you're familiar with our YouTube channel, there's lots of videos there on each of these components. But I mentioned this today because this concept of stakeholder feedback and using it in the context we're going to go through today touches on every single one of these components of data culture. I think we mentioned in the description that collecting stakeholder feedback is such a great way to make sure that your data portfolio is more holistic, right? That you're not just focusing on one specific data source, but thinking more broadly about a comprehensive set that can really inform your leadership, your decision-making, your strategy. That's just one example, but as we go through the conversation today, you might hear me talk about alignment, promoting equity and inclusion, being more responsive to your stakeholders. I want you to know that one of the reasons that I really believe in the power of stakeholder feedback is because of its deep connection to this concept of a strong data culture. So laying that foundation there, but going to jump in then to our content for the day. Now, if you know Education Elements, if you know us well, you know that we like to start with a spark, something that kind of ignites your thinking around the topic, gets you excited about what you're going to learn today and talk about today. But I'm taking a little bit of a risk because if we were, this thing I'm going to tell you about is actually a game that we would play if we were in a room together or if we were on a Zoom call where you all could interact with me. This is one of my favorite sparks, and I think it's such a good one for a conversation today. But because we're in a webinar format, I'm going to take a risk here and I'm going to tell you about it instead of playing the game. And I hope it lands. You can tell me in the chat if it doesn't. I'm open to feedback here. But the name of the game is Ding. And the way that it works is that if we were in a room, we would pick one person or hopefully someone would volunteer and they would leave the room. And while they are gone, we would decide, what do we want that person to do when he or she comes back in the room? If we were on Zoom, we might put them in a breakout room by themselves and then we'd talk about it amongst ourselves. Some examples would be like, we want them to wave at us. Or one time a woman had glasses on her head and we decided we wanted her to touch her glasses. But we just pick something random and then we bring that person back into the room and we don't give them any sort of clue about what it is that we want them to do. We just tell them we want them to do something and they're going to have to figure out what that is. When they start doing stuff, when they start trying, if it's close, we'll say ding. If it's not close, we don't say anything. So for example, if the person who is supposed to wave put their hand up, we might say ding, so they know they're close here. They're not waving it yet, but they're close. If he started dancing, we wouldn't do anything at all because that's not really close to what we wanted them to do. I know this sounds crazy that we would just come up with this random thing and then expect someone to figure it out simply on the action of us saying ding. But I am not even kidding you when I say it has always worked. Every time we've done this, we have gotten to a place where the person figures it out and actually figures it out way quicker than we could have ever anticipated. So I love this spark, particularly for this topic, because I think it very much articulates the power of feedback. And we always debrief when we talk about what did you learn, what ideas were inspired through this exercise. And I'll tell you some of the common things that come out of that debrief to get us into our content today. First, one of the things we always identify is even the simplest of feedback will give you direction. Just saying the word ding is such a small thing, but it really communicates so much to the participants, the person who's trying to figure it out. I think this matters because often when we talk about or when we toss around the idea of collecting feedback, we think it has to be like really great, solid, complex, very well-connected feedback. And the point here is it really doesn't, even the simplest of feedback can give us some direction that's really powerful and that will help us give us better direction in what we're trying to sort through. Of course, though, the more specific the feedback, the better. Something that sometimes happens whenever we go through this is our participants will modify it, right? Like when the person that put their hands up said ding, and then he moves it in, they'd go ding, 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 ding. So they start giving a little bit more specific feedback where they say ding louder or they say it multiple times faster. And when they get more specific in their feedback, it really helps. So that's important in terms of when we think about the best way to collect feedback, right? I think the most important lesson here from this exercise, though, is that psychological safety and vulnerability are really important components of doing this well. I mean, imagine how that person feels when they come back into the room and people are just staring at them and they just have to try it, just do something. They have no idea what they're supposed to do. They feel really vulnerable. They feel like rudderless and directionless. And it requires a lot of psychological safety. And that is 100% true when we make the decision to open ourselves up for feedback. It can feel very vulnerable, and that is normal. And if it doesn't feel vulnerable, you're probably not doing it right. And the only way that feedback becomes as valuable as it can be, or you're really actualizing the full power of it, is when you create a really psychologically safe environment to take that feedback and use it in a powerful way. So I hope you'll play this game. Maybe that's your one thing you take away from today. I want to take this game back to my team and play it. Lots of interesting debriefs, but hopefully that kind of orients you into our content for the day. So as I mentioned, we are going to take kind of a 10,000-foot view of stakeholder feedback in 3 different contexts here: building trust, informing strategy, and driving student outcomes. So let's start with the first one here around building trust. I'm going to talk you through just some general tips first. So I'm going to expand on this idea, talk about my practice and some things I've learned about using stakeholder feedback in this context. And then I'll give you some specific examples to help kind of ground these ideas in something that you can apply maybe in your own context. The first principle here is using a stakeholder feedback experience, or opportunity, not as something just for data collection, but as a trust building exercise. And that may seem obvious, but it's really important that that become part of your purpose, if not your main purpose from the beginning. And if that is your main purpose, it should show up in how you design your stakeholder feedback strategy, the questions you ask, who you involve, how you recruit people to get involved, and then how you use the data. If it's just a data collection exercise for you, it will show up in how you create the questions and how you use the data. But if your goal here, if your purpose, at least in part, is to create trust, is to build trust, you'll see it in the way that you do that work. And I'm going to actually show you some examples here in a minute. We're going to talk about a few different ways to collect stakeholder feedback, but surveys in particular are a way to give voice to what we often refer to as the silent majority. So silent majority would be not the folks over on this one extreme who are like standing on the rooftops and screaming how much they love your school district and how much they love their child's teacher and how happy they are. Like those are your advocates. Those are your, boots on the ground PR team who are just incredibly pleased with your district and doing a lot of great vocalizing of that. Very vocal because they're so happy. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got your folks who are on social media, just trashing you every day, complaining about something that really made them mad. They're very vocal because they're very unhappy for one or more reasons. And then you've got the majority of people in the middle who are happy. They are happy with their child's teacher. They are satisfied and generally pleased with how things are going on the day-to-day, but they are quiet. So when you think about building trust, if that silent majority is a group where you really want to engage and get some data out of and get some feedback of and build relationships with, surveys are a great way to do that because they typically reach a broader people. They require less of a time commitment for engagement. So when we think about trust, if you're really honing in on that group of people, consider using a survey. Focus groups, let's see if I can get this up here. Focus groups, however, a little bit of a different strategy here. If what you're hoping to build trust around and or collect data around is something a little bit more controversy, if your district or school is in a time of turmoil, I would really consider using some focus groups, maybe in addition to a survey. They can be incredibly powerful because they allow for that personal connection with people. I'll give you an example. I had a district, this is years ago, reach out and say, we've got this, one of our schools is really going through a difficult time. They've lost a lot of trust in their principal. We feel like they're going to run her out of town. There's just a lot of stuff they are unhappy with. Can you come and fix this for us, essentially? And our immediate strategy was focus groups. I mean, we certainly want to understand what they are unhappy about. We want to collect some feedback from them and really understand this challenge. But more importantly, we think asking them is going to repair some of the damaged trust here. And focus groups were our chosen method there because we felt like that personal connection was really important. They needed to be sitting in front of someone who was asking them, what do you think about this? Tell me more about that. Explain your experience here. So as you're thinking about, using a stakeholder engagement activity to build trust, is the need to vocalize a silent majority? If so, survey might be a great strategy there. Or if you're really needing to build some more personal trust around a potentially more controversial issue, I would choose the focus group route. The other thing that's really helpful with focus groups is, when you put a survey out there, the way you word the question communicates a lot to your audience. We're going to talk about that here in a second. And you don't really get a chance to clarify because it's online or it's on paper and you're not there explaining your question to people. In focus groups, you have a little bit more of a chance to clarify. So if you ask a question and it's on a topic that triggers a lot of emotion and they misinterpret it, maybe because they come from a place of defensiveness or they're attaching it to an experience that they had, you can clarify. And I think that is really important when you're in a situation where there's just a lot of turmoil or controversy. The last thing I'll say about this, and I'm going to get a little bit more into practice, is that the only thing worse than not asking for stakeholder feedback on a really important topic is asking them and never having the intention of using their feedback. If you're in a situation where you just really can't, you have to make a specific decision and you can't use feedback, you can't make a different decision based on what your stakeholders tell you, don't ask. Because if you ask from a very inauthentic way, they will know. They will see it in the way you're asking. They will see in the way that you use your feedback. And the only thing worse than not building trust with people is breaking it, right? And so I want to name that, and that this only works if that is very much your intention and you really have the ability to and the intention to use their feedback. I'll give you an example just from this webinar. So our check-in question was, tell me what you want out of this webinar. Imagine if I said, glad you guys said that. I'm not even going to look at it. In fact, I've already built the content for this webinar. I'm not changing anything. I'm not talking about anything other than what I'm talking about here today. I just wanted to make you feel like you had an opportunity to weigh in. That feels terrible. Why did I spend time thinking about this and putting something in the chat if it was really just a move to like create this false sense of, care about what I need here? To be clear, I am going to do my best looking at what you've got here and make sure I can make some connections there. But that hopefully that connects the dot there, that like people will know that it'll show up and it'll be obvious to them, and it doesn't feel great. And so I would recommend that like really only use this strategy if, again, you're able and willing to use the feedback and possibly make a decision you weren't anticipating based on what you hear. So I want to apply this to some practice here. And I'm going to actually use the example of a attendance boundary change. This is something I used to do a lot of stakeholder surveying around. And in that world, I would often butt up against times where they really already knew what they were going to do. And so they would administer a survey because they wanted people to feel like they had a role in the process. They pretty much knew what they were going to do, how they were going to change the boundaries, and really because they didn't have any other option. This was their option. So I guess what I'm sharing with you here is actually a non-example. What I want you to see is how that often translates that like inauthentic purpose there when you're doing things like writing survey questions. So let's say that the question was, to what extent do you support these proposed attendance boundary changes? They've done this big communication release. We have to update our boundaries because we're opening a new school or we're closing a school. And so we're going to move some kids around. This is our plan to do it. How do you feel about it? And the answer options are, I support it to a great extent. I support it to some extent. I'm not sure. I'm gonna let that sink in while I take a drink here. So imagine you are a parent who is really upset about this change and you don't support it at all. How would you feel about this question? This question was probably designed from like very good intentions, but from a person who really doesn't have either the option to or the intent to change their mind if a lot of people say they don't support this. This is actually a real question. This was from a project that I did for a district. I hated this question, but they felt very strongly that this is how they wanted to ask it. And man, we got destroyed at a school board meeting when we did like the survey debrief, and people were mad and school board members were mad. And, it was just really obvious that there was no intent here to really understand the extent to which people supported it. So this is kind of an extreme non-example, but I'm showing it because again, the point I'm trying to illustrate here is if you want to build trust through stakeholder engagement, that has to really be your intent. Here's another example or non-example. So oftentimes in this scenario, we'll ask, if your family went through this before, what was the impact on your family? And let's say the responses are, the school had a positive impact on my child. The location was more convenient. The new school had lots of programs or resources that we didn't have at our other one, or there was no impact. This doesn't give any opportunity for someone to say, this was really a bad experience for us. It was hard on us. We didn't love it. So anyone reading this can see that really the intent around here is to collect some data around how this can have a positive impact without any real interest in understanding what the experience was actually like. The reality is that usually, at least from my experience, we find that school changes can be way more positive than people expect them to be. But this question here isn't an authentic approach to really understanding the experience and the impact, which is what it takes to build trust through collecting feedback. So feel free to leave questions. Again, I'm going to try to bounce back and forth and look at questions and general reactions. So please feel free to use the chat to ask any clarifying questions around this concept. We're going to come back to it. But I do want to kind of shift because this is a good segue then into informing strategy. Because oftentimes you're using this stakeholder feedback to make a decision. It's just that you want to build trust along the way. So let's think about that context then. If really we're part of our stakeholder engagement strategy here, our feedback collection is we want to inform either our direction for the year, a strategic decision we have to make, or maybe we're building a strategic plan. What does stakeholder engagement look like in that scenario, or what is the powerful of it there? Or was the power of it there? Great question about check-ins with parents. I will definitely try to work that in here in a second. Thank you, Kristen. So in thinking about informing strategy with stakeholder feedback, I'm going to talk you a little bit through our thinking around this topic at Education Elements. And the quote you see in the middle is really what I want to draw your attention here, is how we engage people in our strategic plan. We feel like that matters just as much, if not more, than what is included in the plan. So put in like more general terms, how you involve people in your decision-making process, we think matters just as much, if not more, than the decision that you eventually make. And there was a reason for that. And it goes back to the building trust, right? You're not always going to make the right decision. You're not always going to make the best plans. But if you have built trust along the way, we feel like that actually is what's setting you up for success, even more so than feeling the pressure to make the right decision or create the best plans along the way. Another way to think about this is, historically, what has been done is we create something and then we try to get people invested in that plan. So like we will go in kind of like a room with our leadership team, and we will create a plan, we will make a decision, and then we will share it out with our community and our stakeholders and say, this was the best decision, this is why you should believe this. So there is an investment there, an engagement, it's just done so after the fact. What we're trying to get people to think of in terms of using stakeholder feedback is actually investing and creating at the same time, collecting this feedback, using it along the way, and creating something as you go. What I'm showing here is just some of our like general tenets around how we advise people around strategic planning or strategic direction. But what I want to really focus you in on are the first two here, because this gets into this concept of collecting stakeholder feedback for strategy. The first one here is that we feel if you bring a lot of perspectives to the table and you are consulting them along the way and you're including them along the way, then the decision that you make and the plan that you design is something that is created with them and not for them. We talk about this a lot in our framework around data culture, especially in like the equity and inclusion space, where we want data to be something that is collected with and analyzed with our stakeholders, rather than something that we report out to them on and say, here's what is true about you or about your students or about your team or about your staff. We want a data system that people are included into, a system where they use the data and they kind of come to their own conclusions, as opposed to us having to feed it out to them. And it's the same concept here with strategy, where if we have a stakeholder engagement system, if we're collecting feedback along the way, we're creating something with them and not for them. The second one here I talked a little bit about before, but this concept of, if we do authentic stakeholder engagement, if we're collecting stakeholder feedback in a really authentic way throughout the process, then there's already high levels of buy-in and less instances of friction around it. Where you get into a scenario where you make a decision and you put it out there in the universe and there's a lot of blowback from it, it's usually because people feel like they weren't involved along the way. So we feel like the process of, again, using stakeholder feedback to drive that strategy along the way, rather than creating it in a room and then sharing it, is something that we have seen a lot of power in terms of building trust. I actually want to go back to the question about regular check-ins with parents. And I think that there's a connection here with this concept of doing it with instead of doing it for. I'm not sure if this is the right context in terms of thinking about check-ins, but I do have 2 elementary age kids. And I think about the ways in which my school and my children's teachers are engaging me in terms of collecting my feedback or sharing information with me, collecting information from me. Historically, those check-ins, I think, have been viewed as like a readout. You know, we want to update you on where your child is, which is more so this like, we create this, we do all this work with your child, then we're going to tell you about it, as opposed to this like invest and create as we go. And so it's an interesting question about stakeholder. Yes, I am a Leander parent and also very good. But I think about these check-ins with parents and how I think that if we're doing them along the way, and if we're thinking about it in terms of including them throughout the process, and they are a partner in this work. We're collecting their feedback around, how do you think this went? How do you feel like your student is engaged in school? What do you think this experience was like for them? That will engage them in a way where I think there's more buy-in in the process. I'm going to keep coming back to that idea, but that was just one connection that came to mind. On the practice side of things, while we're talking about the context of strategy here, I do want to get into some various stakeholder feedback collection methods that I think are interesting to talk about, and talk about the difference of and the values of each. This comes from a resource, our inclusion guide, that I'm going to mention at the end, and we will be sure to share with you in our follow-up email from today. But what I like about this is it goes through, I think, like 6 or 8 different kinds of methods for collecting stakeholder feedback, and the ways in which they can be valuable to you, especially in this context of informing strategy. 2 questions I want you to think about as I go through these methods here. One is, we call this designing rooms. So types of engagements, rooms of engagement. How do we do that in a way that invites and amplifies underrepresented voices? We talked about the silent majority a few minutes ago. There are also going to be underrepresented groups of your community that, for whatever reason, aren't heard or don't have as many opportunities to share their feedback. And so one way to think about this is there a way here that I can amplify their voice without, and this gets to the second question, overburdening them in terms of making them feel like they have to do all the work to have their voice heard? I think using a combination of these strategic rooms here is a good way to try to accomplish both. So the first 2, focus groups, we talked about a lot. What I love about focus groups is it allows for that more personal connection. It allows for more dynamic conversation. You can dig into the why, you can probe a little bit more. You can sort of change your line of questioning as you go to tailor to where the conversation is going. You may think of ideas that you want to ask about that you didn't anticipate ahead of time. The other nice thing about focus groups is you can very strategically select who is involved to make sure that you get representation from perspectives that you need to hear from. When you administer a survey, which is a great method, we'll talk about that here in a second, but when you do, you're kind of at the mercy of whoever decides to respond. With a focus group, you can be really intentional about your selection. One thing I will say about that is you have to make a decision around, do I have a focus group where everyone is representing the same perspective? Like if I'm doing teacher focus groups, do I want all veteran teachers together and all first-year teachers in a separate focus group? Or do I want a more heterogeneous focus group where maybe I mix them all together? There's power in both. I'm going to connect back to building trust. One of the cool things about having a heterogeneous sampling is the learning that happens in the moment, one group from another. I love doing this with parents. If you have parents that represent very different perspectives and experiences in a school district, to have them all in the same room answering the same questions and learning about different experiences can be really powerful. In-depth interviews sounds like something that is a really heavy lift, where if you're thinking, oh my God, if I'm going to use interviews, I work in this huge district, I'm going to have to interview 500 people. It's not true. Use in-depth interviews in a really strategic way, where if there is a perspective, maybe you did surveys and focus groups and you realized, I never heard from a Spanish-speaking parent. I never heard from a teacher who left the district and came back. And I really want to understand what those perspectives are like. Use an interview for that. That's something that can really complement what you've heard, or going back to trust building. If there is a specific stakeholder that is highly influential, who you feel like needs a deeper touch and a more, thoughtful way of engaging in the process, consider a one-on-one interview. Town halls are something that are used a lot in strategic planning and bond elections. I think they have the power to be very effective. It's a great way to get a lot of people in person. It's a great way to share a lot of information at one time. I think you have to be really strategic around how you create the engagement, how you collect the feedback from a large group of people at once. Certainly possible. I will also say that we are operating in a very different climate right now than we were 5 years ago when I was doing more of this work. 5 years ago, I used town halls a lot. I'll be completely honest with you, I use them less now. And I use them less now because they are risky, to be completely transparent. They create the potential for them to be hijacked for like a special interest group or for a something that is very unrelated to what we're hoping to engage our community on and collect feedback about. I don't say that in a way to like scare you away from doing it, because I think the worst reaction to that is to not do something, to let it paralyze you. But I say it going into it ready to mitigate that risk and ready to address it and have systems and processes in place to make sure that it achieves the purpose behind your town hall. If that's something you need and want help with, I hope you'll reach out to me after this webinar. I can definitely share some of my experience with you. Empathy interviews, very similar to in-depth interviews, but a slightly different purpose here. It's not just generally collecting stakeholder feedback from them. It's not just in general engaging them in this process. It's with a very specific intention of understanding their specific experience. So you might start with a more in-depth interview. You see this in the description there, but in the setting, you really focus on their experience. You give them some time to process information that you share with them. It's very tailored towards really understanding their specific stakeholder experience. A couple more here, and then we will move on to driving student outcomes. But we also love the strategy of shadowing, of walking alongside people in your community. We do this a lot in our personalized learning work, where we will go into schools and do like a teacher shadow. We will walk alongside them for a day. We'll do a student shadow, walk alongside them to see what their experience is like in a school. I love the idea of doing this with families. It's just like it sounds, it's like a learning walk. You shadow them for a day. It's very similar in the idea of a community walk. However, instead of just a very specific stakeholder in their context, you're more so looking from the view of your community. Maybe you are observing a specific facility in your community, and you're placing yourself there to see how stakeholders come in and out of that experience, but you're collecting feedback by observing, essentially, is the concept behind both of these here. Great question around virtual setting. We have actually done this a lot in a virtual setting. We have done it in terms of, obviously when kids are learning online, it's a little bit easier to shadow a student in terms of like going to their specific online learning opportunities along with them throughout the day. We've done it with teachers whenever they are in an online format. I will say, I don't know that we have truly figured it out for like a family or a community walk and in an online setting. All the other ones we have done online, which I'll mention. All the interviews we've done online. We've done a lot of online focus groups over the past 2 years. So probably the only thing that I feel like we haven't quite figured out is maybe a family walk or a community walk. But I do think there are some innovative ways we could figure that out. Certainly happy to be a thought partner with you on that. And then the last ones here, we've talked quite a bit about surveying, so I won't go too much into that, but I do want to mention bulletin boards. This is another typically electronic means of engagement. There's lots of different technology platforms out there now that allow for this, but the idea is that it is a very public bulletin board. You're asking a couple of questions, and instead of them responding in kind of like a closed, like individual way, like you see on a survey, they're responding very publicly, and other people read their responses and can react to it. They can upvote it, they can downvote it. There's some free ways that you can do this, like Padlet is a great example. We've seen people use Padlets very publicly. There's obviously paid solutions for this, but it's an interesting way to pay attention to group dynamics, to crowdsource ideas. The only caution I would say on this is you very much are going to get majority rules type of scenario here. So the feedback that floats to the top is going to be what the majority of your population believes and supports and align with their experience. So you just have to be really intentional about making sure that you are looking at your less represented populations and how their perspectives may or may not show up in the use of a bulletin board. All right, we are in kind of like the last third of our conversation today. So I want to spend that time talking about driving student outcomes. And then, as I said, I'm going to make sure I share some resources with you at the end and some opportunities to get deeper into this content if you'd like to. I usually don't make a habit of reading off of slides to people, but this quote I think is so impactful that I am going to read it to you. So I hope you don't mind. Students know effective teaching when they see it. Most importantly, they can effectively evaluate a teacher's ability to control the classroom environment and to challenge students with rigorous work. One more time for the people in the back. Students know effective teaching when they see it. There are, I think, two groups of people when it comes to talking about collecting stakeholder feedback. Because to be clear, when I talk about stakeholder feedback to drive student outcomes, I'm talking specifically around collecting student feedback. And I'll tell you why here in a second. But people have strong opinions about student feedback. And I mentioned there are two camps. There's the camp that feels like, oh yeah, this is powerful. They are totally bought into it and they do it regularly in a very consistent way. And then there are people that feel like, nope, I don't think students can provide very valuable feedback and it's too risky here. Like the way we use this data, I think there's too much variability in it. It's not rigorous data. We're not doing it. I am going to try to convince those of you here that this is where you belong. And it's okay if you don't, but I have to tell you, the deeper I've gotten into this work, the more I've been convinced that this quote here holds true, which by the way, is from the Measures of Effective Teaching Project, that students can provide such valuable feedback on what is happening in the classroom and strategies that you want to invest in to help them improve and to drive the outcomes that you're looking for all of your kids. There's a wide body of research behind this that supports this, that there are specific academic and non-academic indicators that drive student outcomes that are very much tied to how students feel. I've listed some of them here. Things like they feel that teachers care about them. They feel like people are interested in them learning, or that they are interested in their own learning. They feel like ideas are clearly explained to them. So just to say again, this is specifically around how students feel. And the idea here is that if students feel this way, we are going to see increases in their outcomes and their learning and their student experience in general. The only way to really understand if they feel this way is to ask them. And that's the reason I very much believe in student feedback. I mean, there's a way to use it and there's a way not to use it, which we're going to talk about. But when we talk about the power of stakeholder feedback, specifically to drive student outcomes and specifically student feedback, it's asking them about how they feel, right? It's not asking them, did your teacher do a good job of this or bad job of this? It's, do you feel this way? And again, we feel like we can ask students this and get an accurate read of it because they know good teaching when they see it. They know if their classroom environment is one that is conducive to their learning. They know if they are being challenged in their work. So they can accurately answer how they feel about questions like this whenever we ask them. So some tips here in thinking about how to use student feedback, though, if you are going to go this route. The first thing there is that it has to feel very actionable. So if you ask students a question, do you feel like your teacher cares about you? Or my teacher cares about me, agree, disagree. And then you give that data point to a teacher, and let's say it's not great. You know, the result there is not exactly what you would want it to see. And you just hand that data point over to a teacher. That does not feel actionable. It's given to me in a way that it feels like you got to do something about this, because we know that students need to feel like their teachers care about them in order to do well in school. The way that you collect and share student feedback has to feel actionable in the way that there's coaching built around it. There are supports there. There's time taken to look at the student feedback and identify the kinds of supports that we need to provide as leaders in order for teachers to feel like, okay, I see this data point. This is what I can do to try to grow this next year. And now I'm excited to put some of these practices in place and see what my data look like next year. I mean, I liken it to, okay, we're at the beginning of the year. A lot of people set health goals for themselves this year, right? You step on the scale on January 1st, you're getting right out of the holidays and you're like, oh, I don't love what I'm seeing on this scale right now, but I know what I can do. I'm going to change some of my eating choices here. I'm going to set a goal to get out and walk every day this week. It's actionable. I feel like I can do something about it. And I'm excited to then step on that scale again next Monday and see if there's any change there. That's what we're after here. This actionable, not here's a data point, I don't know what to do with this, and now I'm just dejected and feel frustrated. But we're sharing student feedback in a way that, again, feels actionable for a teacher. Not using it for punitive or evaluative purposes. There are lots of people that do this. And if you are doing this, I don't want you to feel like you're doing it wrong, because there are, I think, some really great teacher evaluation systems out there that are using student feedback in some powerful ways. So I'm making a pretty generalized statement here, but I'm making it specifically for those of you that are thinking about doing this for the first time. If you want to start collecting stakeholder or student feedback, particularly around their classroom environment and their teacher practices, don't start out using it for punitive or evaluative purposes. Really, the only outcome that you can expect out of that is teachers that feel very defensive and don't feel empowered to use it in any sort of meaningful way, or to inform their instructional practices, or for leaders to use it in a way that drives professional development, or really sort of any thoughtful strategy or intervention outcome. Instead, it just becomes this negative thing that people associate a lot of emotion to, and they really what really happens is they start devaluing it. They start pointing out all of the ways why it's not valuable, it's not accurate, we shouldn't be doing this. So my advice to you, if you're going to start doing this for the first time, or you're very early in this process, don't use it for punitive or evaluative purposes. And then this last point here gets back to our spark at the beginning of this conversation, the ding exercise. Can you imagine how that person feels when they walk in a room and everyone's looking at them and they don't have any feedback yet? And then all of a sudden people just say ding at them a lot. It's, you feel very vulnerable. You have like a lack of direction. You have no idea what people want you to do. And then all of a sudden you start kind of doing crazy things, reacting to their feedback. It's very similar to the kind of scenario we put teachers in and school leaders in when we very first start collecting student feedback. But I think that's okay, as long as we create these environments that have a ton of psychological safety, and we've modeled vulnerability, we've celebrated failures, we have the environment and the culture in place where teachers and leaders can use this feedback in a really valuable way. You have to commit to creating that culture if this is going to work for you. And that is hard work. It's really hard work. And so maybe you feel like you already have that. And you're like, I can do this. This is something we can add in because we've really got that kind of culture with our teachers. If not, I would say invest your time on creating this first, and then start experimenting with using stakeholder or student feedback here. Okay. We're in our last 10 minutes here. I know we've got some great questions. I am also going to save this chat. So if I don't get to everyone, I will try to reach out to you after the webinar today and give you some thoughts on this. But I mentioned one of the objectives here is I wanted you to feel like you have something that you can try, that you can take away from today. One of the biggest barriers I see in people taking the leap to collect more stakeholder feedback or use it for different things like building trust or driving student outcomes is feeling like, okay, this is a big undertaking. I have to make it perfect. I have to have this perfect plan before I start going out in the community and asking questions in a survey, or hosting focus groups, or administering a student survey to get their feedback on, classroom environment. It feels like a big thing that you have to get perfect before you do it. So usually what happens is people spend a ton of time trying to figure it out, accounting for every possible risk that could happen. They spend a ton of time, they run into a barrier, and then they eventually feel like it's too hard and they drop it. Or they spend so much time doing it that by the time that they finally launch it, they've sort of lost everyone on the way. It's not as high of a priority as it was when they really got the buy-in and the momentum around it. So I'm going to borrow, to kind of push you out of that thinking, I'm going to borrow a concept from the New School Rules, which, if you're not familiar with, it's a text written by our CEO, Anthony Kim, and Alexis Gonzalez-Black, formerly from Zappos. I love this text. I use it a lot. There's a lot in it. If you've never read it, I recommend putting it on your list this year. But the concept today that I'm going to pull from is this idea of safe enough to try. One of the points they make in the book is one of the biggest barriers to decision making is this false promise of consensus. That often in organizations, we feel like we've got to get everyone on board and everyone agrees. And, we've got like all of the details figured out here. And we're only going to make a decision when we get to that point. And the idea here is that that's going to become a really big barrier in any sort of change or any sort of decision making. And even when you get there, it's kind of this false sense of consensus, because usually what's happened is people who oppose it just kind of give up and say, okay, fine, this is a good idea. I don't want to argue about it anymore. So it's not even really consensus. It's just essentially you've worn everyone down until you feel like there's no opposition there. So I would encourage you to think about, when you're thinking, now what, something that I want to try, think about, is this good enough for now? Like, can I try this out in a safe enough way that if it fails, we can recover? There's no like major risk here. And again, thinking differently from like, can I get everyone to agree with this, to like, can I get to a safe enough try version? Having a really robust and I think like highly successful stakeholder feedback system starts small. You try it out in little ways, you put it out there in the world, you learn from it, you adapt, you make it better, then you go bigger, then you build on it. School systems that do this in a really powerful way have been tinkering away at it for years. They're trying it in small ways, they're learning from it, and then they're scaling it. So when you think about now what today, if it feels very big, I would encourage you to think about, what is a safe enough to try version that I could start with tomorrow or next week that I could put out there and learn from and then build on. Okay, I should have changed this to checkout. We're not yet done, so don't leave yet because I want to give you some resources. But as we're doing the kind of like 5-minute wrap up here, I would love for you to drop in the chat something that feels safe enough to try. So just like we like to check in, we also like to check out of conversations. And so I'm hoping that as I walked you through, this, some of these ideas, again, 10,000 foot view. I know we didn't get super deep into a lot of these topics, but hopefully it sparks something you may want to try, and then framing it around, okay, this is safe enough. Even if it totally fails, there's not a lot of risk involved. If you have some of those ideas, please drop them in the chat because it might inspire some thinking from other people here in the webinar. But before you go, some resources we're going to share out. I'm actually going to start on the right and go left. So the Include Guide, this is where you get all of those rooms for stakeholder engagement, those slides that I showed that had all the different ones. So if you want to dig deeper into those, we're going to link to it in our follow-up email here. The one in the middle for good measure is our guide on building a strong data culture. So if you saw that framework in the beginning, you were like, this is interesting. I want to dig more into what these concepts are. I mentioned that we've got a lot of YouTube videos on our channel that you can look at, but also this guide here goes deep into each of the components of that framework. And then the one on the left, I mentioned our organization uses Tripod's 7Cs survey instrument to collect student feedback. And this is actually a guide for improving teaching and learning through that specific instrument. So if you're interested in that instrument, this will go through like what the 7 components are. Or if you're just interested in the concept of using student feedback to drive student outcomes, this would be a good guide to look through to think about, how do I make this really actionable for my teachers and for my school leaders? Okay, and then the last objective is, I told you, I'm hoping to get you guys interested in joining a community of practice around this. We are hoping to kick this off actually at the end of this month with a institute here. I'm in Austin. I didn't say that at the beginning, but I'm in Austin, Texas. So we're hosting an institute here at the end of the month around this topic, using stakeholder surveys to build data culture. It's actually an all-day event, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. We're going to have breakout sessions around each of these topics. We have a keynote from Dr. Ron Ferguson, who is the originator of that 7C survey. So he's going to talk a lot about how student feedback specifically can drive outcomes. It is an in-person event. I know travel may be hard. So if this is something that you're interested in, but you're like, I can't swing getting there in person, let me know. If anything, I'd be happy to share content with you after. But we are hoping to launch an ongoing community of practice out of this event. So if you can't attend, but you want to be part of that, also something to let us know, and we will include you on that list once we get all of that together. All right, and then we have a webinar series that's launching this month as well. So on the 25th, we're going to do some surveying results, and then there's lots of stuff outside of just stakeholder engagement that obviously our organization talks about and uses. And so you're welcome to join any of these conversations throughout the rest of February and March. You can register on our website, super easy to find. Just actually Google Ed Elements webinars and you will find them and find out how to register. And then the last thing in our last couple of minutes, I would love any feedback from you if you have it. I'm actually going to see if I can copy this. I'm going to get out of presentation mode so I can copy this for you and put it in the chat. I would really, really love your feedback on how today went. If you have any follow-up questions, this is another good way. Oh, thank you, Leslie. Another good way to let us know. But again, I'm going to save the chat, and then I'm going to look at registrations and reach out to any of you that I didn't get to, just to make sure I can give you some context. I did put my email at the beginning, but if you missed it, it's super easy, Shelby@EdElements. In fact, I'll put it in the chat right now. Oh, thank you, Leslie. You're welcome to reach out to me directly if you want to dig into this and any more on any specific topic. I have to say, this is the first webinar I've ever done where I have ended like right on the nose. So either I'm super early or super late. So thanks for hanging in there with me. I hope this was valuable to you, but if not, reach out to me. Let me know what else you need, and we want to help. So thanks again. You will get a follow-up email from us soon with this content, in addition to those extra resources. So I will let you guys go. Hope you have a wonderful Tuesday and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye, guys.